my time. Good morning, afternoon, evening, maybe good night, depending on where you're joining from. Thank you for joining us for this Build Your Backend using FastAPI with Ashmi Banerjee. Ashmi is a full-time data scientist at a leading telco in Germany and a self-taught hobby web developer. She has a master's degree in informatics with a focus on machine learning and artificial intelligence from Technical University of Munich, Germany. She gets excited about new technical challenges and automating mundane tasks using technology. She's also an avid traveler and a budding triathlete. Very impressive. She's passionate about building the gender gap in STEM. So with that, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you very much, Emily, for the introduction. So, hello everyone, I am Ashmi, and in this talk, you will learn how to build a modern, high-performant backend for your web application. If I'm just not looking at the camera, it means I'm just looking at the screen where I have your thing. So, I have the window open. So yeah, modern web applications nowadays expect very high performant, robust and scalable REST APIs that can be built in very minimal time. And today in this talk, I will introduce you to one such framework, Python-based framework called FastAPI. And I will also motivate you why FastAPI is a great choice for such application. And guess what? I forgot to share my screen. So you should be able to see my screen. Yes. But before we begin, I would expect you to have some basic knowledge of Python. Well, I'm not expecting you to be a pro or an expert there. But then when I talk about Python, you should have the idea that I'm not talking about the snake, but I am actually talking about the programming language. I also would expect you to have some understanding, some basic level of understanding of machine learning, like what it is and how does web or API frameworks work. So if you have some basic idea of these three things, I hope it will not be too difficult for you to follow or understand the presentation. So let's begin. First, I will talk about the different types of web architecture. So specifically two types of web architecture, the traditional one and the modern one. And then I will talk about some commonly used Python backend frameworks in the industry and their pros and cons. Then I will select FastAPI among these, and then talk about its special features and why it's great or why it's better than the other ones. Next, we will look into the implementation of a machine learning app using FastAPI. So this is one of the most common use cases nowadays because like everyone, so machine learning is a very, very popular topic, and it's important to serve your models once you have trained them on some data set. It's important to serve your models through some APIs so that you can access them or integrate them in your apps. I'll talk about it later in details, but just to give you some flavor. So we will see how we can implement such an app, and then we can serve it using FastAPI. And then we will look into a live demo of working code. Finally, we will talk about the next steps. So once you have your app ready, what do you do with it? How can you, basically, what are the next steps that you need to take or that you need to undertake before you have your app in production or it's being used? So let's get started. Web architecture. So the traditional model of web architecture was that you would have a web page, and then, so basically you would have a web browser, and then you will open a website inside this web browser. So now this website will make calls to the server, so get requests to the server. The server computes the HTML, and then returns this HTML as a whole to to the website. So that means all the components of the website, both the static and the dynamic components, get rendered or get loaded at the same time. This is slightly time consuming, but yeah. So by static components here, I am referring to the things that the components of the website that are not changing. For example, the header, the footer, the the content, etc. And by dynamic components, I am referring to the stuff that gets changed. So for example, if you have a website that displays personalized information, so it will change from user to user. So this username is, say, for example, the dynamic component of this particular website. Um, so yeah, that's how it was earlier. Now let's see how it changed in the present. Now we still have a a website open inside a browser, and but then now we are making the website loads. So they make two requests. So one, it makes a request to the CDN, which is the Content Delivery Network, and it also makes a request to the server. So the Content Delivery Network loads all the JavaScript. So the Content Delivery Network is responsible for storing the JavaScript and then rendering the JavaScript. So that is JavaScript and the static components, while the server computes the result, and then it returns the JSON, which then is like used to fill the gaps in the JavaScript. So that is the dynamic component. So now the advantage of such a model is that things are faster because you can just load the static thing very fast and separately, and then the dynamic thing is also very fast because you're just making API calls there and you're not sending the whole thing over the server. So just to summarize, then in the traditional architecture, we had the server, which generates the HTML. So this is a sample HTML code, and then which is used to generate both the static and the dynamic components, so the entire web page. While now what happens is we have in addition to the server, we also have the CDN. And this so the server generates the JSON, and the CDN generates the JavaScript. The JSON is, or the JavaScript is used for loading the static components, while the JSON is used to load or fill in the gaps in the data, that is the dynamic components. So now let's look into some commonly used backend frameworks. There are lots, but I'll just highlight some most common ones. The first web app that I ever built was using Django, the Django REST framework to be more specific. And the problem or the challenge that I had was I had to use the Django REST framework because nowadays I was building something for recent times, so API-based thing. So I had to use something that is not ideally meant for APIs. So Django is quite old. It has been there for a while, but it's also not suited for APIs, I must tell you. So even though I was building my first app maybe a few years ago, and I was trying to use Django, since it's not really suited for APIs, I needed additional packages, so the Django REST framework to build it. And then I had to write everything from scratch because Django is such a framework. It's a full stack framework, which they advertise it as batteries included, which means it comes with the database model, the middleware, everything. So that means when I was writing my or building my backend, I had to write everything from scratch. So I had to implement everything from scratch, like the serializers, data validation, everything. And actually, I even spent so much time in debugging a small issue in data validation that I was like, why do they not have these things automated? But yeah, so even though it worked pretty seamlessly in the end, I struggled a lot a lot during the development phase with petty errors that could be solved if things were a bit more automated there. So next, I thought of using Flask to build my backend for my app. It was better than Django because it was really modular and it was fast and lightweight. So, but then it was still not perfect because when I wanted to interact with my APIs, I had to either write some HTML and CSS so that I can see them or interact with them on my browser, or I had to use some third-party apps like Postman so that I can use Postman to interact with them. So I felt like I just want to build some endpoints, some APIs, and I don't want to write a lot of HTML and CSS, right? So I felt like Flask was better, but still there was a lot of code and definitely lesser than Django, but still a lot of overhead, a lot of code that I needed to write, which was beyond the task that I wanted to actually accomplish. And then, while being on that search for a better web framework, I came across FastAPI. As you can see, it's a relatively new framework, which has been around for like 4 years now. And the biggest challenge, or two of the biggest challenges that I had earlier, was basically like this data validation problem. So somewhere I was using string, and when I was supposed to use a float in Django, and then I struggled a lot. I spent a lot of hours trying to debug and then realizing my problem. But then in FastAPI, it offered an automated data validation support for me. So it was typed and it was validating my data types, and I didn't have to spend hours scratching my hair trying to debug this problem. And another thing that I always dreaded, as I mentioned earlier, was this writing of HTML and CSS. But FastAPI offered this amazing automatic interactive API documentation where you could just have an interaction or with your API endpoints right from your browser without having to write any extra line of code. So when I was introduced to FastAPI, I realized that I do not have to focus on anything else other than my app logic. So that was pretty impressive for me. Now comes the obvious question that there are so many things, but so many available frameworks, but which one should we choose? If you are having an API-based ML application, I would say you should either go for Flask or FastAPI, because depending on your use case, what you have, if you are looking into scalability and performances, then I would select FastAPI between Flask and FastAPI. But otherwise, I would say they are okay. And if you also don't want to write HTML and stuff, then go for FastAPI because it's really fast. Not only in terms of execution, but also in terms of development. So it's really easy. You will see in a second how you can easily develop your machine learning model, or sorry, your backend, and serve your machine learning model. So I summarized some of the pros and cons that I found, or some of the features of these things. And I would say that if you are looking for something like where you do not need so much of modularity and you're okay with the databases that are offered by Django or the others, like the robot, if you are looking into building a robust full stack framework, then obviously Django would be your choice. It also offers a number of packages and a larger community. This is because it has been there for a while. Whereas if you're looking more into modularity and faster development or better performance and scalability, then obviously FastAPI would be your go-to thing. But again, it depends entirely on your use case and what you want to accomplish. So now let's look into some FastAPI features and why the things that I mentioned, why they are good. So as you might have guessed, that FastAPI is a high-performing Python framework that has been there, like it's quite new and has been there for like 4 years now, and it's production ready and it's widely used in the net industry. A lot of companies have now migrated their apps from Django or other frameworks to FastAPI. The features, as I already mentioned, the key features that I already mentioned before was the automatic interactive API documentation. So you don't have to use any third-party application or anything, but you can just go to your browser and then interact with your API endpoints. It allows for async I/O operations, which means that it uses the server resources very efficiently, and therefore it can be used for parallelization and building of scalable applications. And obviously, it is highly performant, so you can just focus on the actual logic and you don't have to write or think about any other things. So it reduces your number of lines of code, and it leads to a very quick development of the REST endpoints. Now, let's look into the implementation of an ML app using FastAPI. First, let's see what it means. So say you have a machine learning model, which you have trained using the data, and now you would like to interact with it somehow. And then, so here we are showing that some AlexNet model, it can be anything actually, so it doesn't really matter. And then now you would want to make a web API. This is because you would like to show it to your colleagues, or you would like to interact or integrate it with the other internal apps, or even deploy it to production, because and for that you need a web API, because if you do not have a web API, you might want to you will struggle with this huge machine learning model app. This huge machine learning model being, I don't know, do you want it to be in your app or in your phone? But then that doesn't make sense, because it just makes things slower and more inefficient. Hence, you would want to have it behind an API, so that your application makes calls to this API, there's a computation, and then you get back the information. I'll just show you in a second. So let's take the use case of a FastAPI image classifier, where you have a front end where you take the image URL, and then you make an API call to the backend. It's okay if you can't read this part. We will see it in a second. And then it does so let's just consider it to be some black box for now, and then it does some magic there, and then finally it predicts what the image is. So in this case, the predicted image is of a Samoyed dog, which is a dog species, and it predicts it with a probability of 72%. So this is exactly what we are doing, or we are looking into this use case. But our focus will definitely be the backend or the FastAPI part. The first step is to create the API endpoints in a file called app.py. There, you need to, obviously, you need to first install FastAPI and then import it in your code. And then create the app instance of FastAPI, and you can put any title there. Here we have used image classifier API, but you can use any title of your choice. Now here we define the first endpoint, or the by default endpoint. So so that when you go to the docs, you see this is the default endpoint, which is a GET request, and it just returns a sample message, hello world, but it can be anything. It doesn't have to be this. Next comes the image classifier. So basically here we will build another endpoint where we will use where we are doing the prediction. So it is going to be a post endpoint uh, with the uh, with the postfix of predict, and when it is and here we make the definition. So here we compute the prediction. So this is making the call to the model where it's running the classifier with the image URL. And then it is returning a JSON, which is saying that what is the label, the prediction label, and the probability. So how much with whatever probability it is asserting the image. So next step is to implement the prediction, which is the run classifier function here. I will not go into the details of how we are implementing this or the machine learning models used and stuff because that is beyond the scope of the talk. But I'll just walk you through the basic steps that we are using there. So first we are loading the image and just checking if the image is null, then there's nothing to return. And then we are doing some pre-processing on the image, followed by some prediction. Consider it to be a black box here, as I said, because the machine learning details are not a part of the talk or beyond the scope of the talk. So top labels, and then we are returning the first label, so the label that was predicted with the maximum probability. So that's what is happening here. Next, actually, that's what we are done. Now we just need to implement the main function where we are running the UV-corn thing. So it's a server for FastAPI, and we run it. And then we basically view our API, or it can interact with our API on this or at this URL. So let's look at the demo. I hope it works. So this is the URL that I was using. And let's see. So if you remember, we created two endpoints, a GET request and a POST request. So let's try with the GET. It should return a string. So, and then let's try it out. And it doesn't take in any parameters. So we did this. And here, look, hello world. So it works. The next endpoint is basically our predict endpoint, where we need to put an image URL. So I have already opened this image URL. So let's take this and let's see what it says. We have this, we do this, it's doing something, and there you go. So it predicts it as SAM08 with a probability of 72%. So that's pretty good for a pre-trained model. So yeah, that's the demo. And now that you have seen how it works and the demo, I would like to tell you a bit about the next steps and what you can do once you have created the endpoints for your apps. And yeah, so the first and the most important step is to test your app thoroughly before you do anything else. So this is important because testing actually reduces the number of bugs. So it discovers a lot of bugs, and it helps you fix those. And it also ensures like a very smooth deployment, because if you do not have bugs and if you have tested your code for almost all use cases, then it's very unlikely that it's going to produce some weird bugs when deployed in production. And it is also one of the steps which ensures that you have written good code, clean code, and it's definitely considered to be one of the very important best practices of software development. The next thing is to containerize your application. So when you develop an application, it is most likely that you have set some configuration variables, some configurations, and some other environment variables, and you have all those things done in your own machine. But If you want to run the app in production, obviously these things need to be somehow transported there in production environment. And you also would like to make sure that whatever you have done in your local machine is actually replicated in the production, and there is no surprise or no unexpected bugs or unexpected things happen there, because that would mean that the entire thing crashes. Hence, what we do is we containerize the whole thing. So we wrap the whole thing in one unit, and you can use anything. So one of the most common containerization processes or containerization techniques is to use Docker. And what it does, it is wraps your entire environment, your entire configuration files, everything into one single unit. And then you can send this single lightweight unit to production so that you avoid all the unexpected scenarios. And once you have done that, so then the next step is to deploy it. You have a variety of options where you can deploy it. So could be AWS, Google Cloud, Azure, DigitalOcean, etc. So it's up to you where you would like to deploy it, because unless and until you deploy it, your app won't be accessible, and hence you kind of need to deploy it for that purpose. With this, I come to the end of the content of the presentation, and I would like to have a very quick recap of what we studied or what we learned. As you may have learned until now, that FastAPI is a very high-performing Python framework, which can be used to serve ML models in production. And it can also be used for a very quick development of the REST endpoints. So these are some of the things that it can be used for. And yeah, so with this, I come to the end of my presentation. I have summarized all the resources, including the acronyms and the other further readings and source code here under this URL, and please feel free to check them out. And yeah, I am looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ashmi. Wonderful presentation. There was a comment in the chat about loving the memes, and retweet on that one. Great memes throughout. But thank you for covering some of the history, the different frameworks, pros and cons, and then bringing us through to where FastAPI fits within that landscape and how you've been using it. We did have one question a little bit earlier in the chat. I believe it was when you were walking through traditional versus modern web applications, and this was from Jocelyn. Is JavaScript always stored in the CDN regardless of what front end or back end framework you're using?
Yes.
All right. A quick and easy answer.
Yeah, it's always in the CDN, and because the CDN is responsible for loading your static assets, so it's always in the CDN. So that's the job of the CDN.
Great. We've got another question. Can you add comments, description text to the params that are used in the Swagger UI directly from FastAPI?
Sorry, I didn't get it.
So over in the session chat from Karthik, can you add comments, description text to the params that are used in the Swagger UI directly from FastAPI?
I am not sure, but I think it should be possible. So the comments you can't, but then you can always tweak your backend to actually have some response body. So some like show some error response or like handle the errors that way.
Great. And thank you, Mika, for sharing that link in the chat. Do we have any other questions for Ashmi?
I can actually tell you a bit about some of the common questions that I often get. Um, for example, one of the very common questions that I got was basically like, is Django really outdated? But then why are we using Django? Okay, I already got a question. So maybe I can answer both. So first, the thing that I was talking about, like, is Django outdated? Yes, it's kind of, but then there are a lot of applications which are still using Django. And example, Instagram, actually, they are still using Django for some parts. And there exists still a big community, so it's hard to actually say that whether it's completely fully outdated and you should retire it. But overall, I would say it's, and then it offers these external frameworks. So yeah. And now coming back to the question, can you use both Django and FastAPI alongside each other? Um, I would say that, I mean, depends. Again, I mean, you cannot build the same endpoint with both, right? But you can use like parts of it for, maybe if you really want to, you can use it for parts of it for your some application, and then maybe uh, fast API for a different part of your application. But then it entirely depends on what we are tackling or what kind of problem, what kind of application we are talking about. But in general, I would not combine the two. Is it still worth to learn Django? You can. You definitely, I would not say that do not learn Django, because I think once I learned Django, I realized that I mean, it was easier for me to appreciate Flask and FastAPI more, because I knew that, okay, for Django, I had to write so much on my own and the whole process took so long. But now I know, okay, this is more efficient and I can do it. So I think that that's also a good learning practice. Maybe you do not use it, but still you can learn it. Can you give us a comparison? I, in terms of number of companies using Django, Flask, and Fast API, can you give us a comparison? Unfortunately, not. My knowledge is only limited to the information that is out there on the web, and because not a lot of companies reveal what they are doing. So I am unable to give you a number for that. But I think I read some article recently which said that, which I also highlighted in the beginning, that a lot of companies are migrating from Django and other frameworks to Fast API nowadays.
Great. Thank you for answering those questions. We still have time for a few more if anyone wants to add questions to the chat. I have one for you, Ashmi.
Sure.
Have you always been a Python engineer, or what did your engineering journey look like?
So I think I would say that during my bachelor's, I didn't know Python. So I was using either Java or C. But then when I started my master's, and since it was kind of inclined towards AI and machine learning in this area, I started picking up Python. And then I was amazed by how much Python can do, and how much it reduced all the complexities. Like I mean, for Java, I was writing, I don't know, several lines to just take a simple input from the user. But for Python, it was just a single line. And so it was like I really fell in love with Python. And then ever since, there had been no turning back.
Yeah, Python's definitely a lot less code and easier to read. I started with Ruby, which I feel like is somewhat synonymous with Python.
Yes.
And yeah, it removes a lot of complexity for you. Looks like we got an additional question. How did you go about learning these machine learning algorithms, and where do you recommend a newbie start?
Good question. I had some courses back at the university where I was introduced to machine learning and I enjoyed them. So I picked it up from there. I also did some Kaggle projects or some, I also wrote my master thesis in this area. So it was kind of that way relevant. But if you are looking for a place to start, I would definitely recommend you to check out Kaggle, because they have a lot of resources, they have a lot of competitions going on, they have a lot of other things which are really helpful. They even have some courses actually, or maybe some other e-learning platforms like Coursera. I can totally recommend the deep learning specialization offered by deeplearning.ai there, Andrew Ng. So yeah, that one was really helpful for me.
And what was the name of the first one you mentioned? Kaggle? Is that what
Yeah,
you said? I haven't heard of it
Kaggle.
before.
Yeah, so Kaggle.
Great. Thank you for sharing. And then it
Welcome.
looks like we have a question about the Django FastAPI package versus just using the normal FastAPI. Is there a difference between those?
Honestly, I have never used this Django Fast API package, and I do not know how flexible or what it has. So I cannot really tell you like my opinion on it.
Okay. And from Patience, I know that you are a data scientist, but I'll let you answer the data scientist or web developer, and which one do you have to be to use FastAPI to build machine learning apps?
I would say I would be inclined towards data scientist more, because it's actually called ML Ops, which means machine learning operations. And there is also there are lots of courses, there are lots of materials out there how you can be an ML Ops person. So it's a combination of machine learning plus DevOps. So if you are specifically talking about deploying your machine learning apps into production, then I would say MLOps would be the right fit for you. So there you would need some information about ML, as well as some information about operations, or operations, DevOps.
Great. And from Andrea, how long have you been working in this area, and do you feel that you're a specialist in this or senior in your role?
I have been working, so I graduated 3 years ago almost, and since then I've been working in this area. I would still not consider myself to be a specialist or a senior, definitely not. So I would say I'm still learning. So yeah.
The life of an engineer. It's always still learning.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, we'll give a couple more moments to see if we have some additional questions roll in.
Mhm.
All right, well, thank you all again for joining this presentation by Ashmi Banerjee, Build Your Backend Using FastAPI. I know I learned a lot, and I am certain that those in attendance did as well, so thank you for sharing.
You're welcome. Thanks for giving me the chance to share.